All right, well, let's get going. We've got a lot to cover. Let me just, I'll start with an introduction. My name's Mike Nelson. I'm the Vice President of Digital Trust at DigiCert. My background, I've been in healthcare for over 20 years. I started my career at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, creating policy that drove the adoption of technology. And this was early days EHR. And I then left the department and went to GE Healthcare to build medical devices and software that was running on them, and learned how hard it was to implement regulations at a medical device side. And that's where I saw firsthand the challenges of cybersecurity at GE and some of the things. And this was early 2000s. Cyber was it was not well understood at the time. I left, went and did some consulting in healthcare for a little boutique consulting firm, and then DigiCert called, and I've been at DigiCert for about 10 years. DigiCert is a global leader in cryptography, and cryptography is the anchor point when you're implementing cybersecurity. And we'll talk about, so today's agenda, we're talking about cybersecurity and what the FDA is doing to help increase the security of medical devices that are going to market. So let me just start by asking, I just want to know so I can tailor my discussion, make sure that it's relevant and we talk about things that matter to you. But how many of you are with medical device manufacturers? All right, most of you. Any of you with healthcare delivery organizations? Okay, good. So you guys care about this. Any insurance? I think mostly we have medical device, which is good. So I'll tailor my comments towards that, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact for HDOs and how that's going to benefit you guys. But as of October 1st, 2023, the Food and Drug Administration received the regulatory authority to actually deny medical devices that don't meet adequate cyber protections from going to market. Big landscape move for cybersecurity in healthcare. As more and more devices become connected and are exposed to cyber threats, the Department of Food and Drug Administration, the industry, saw this as a big threat. And the FDA in 2023, this was not the first time they've been thinking about it. They had put out pre-market guidance and post-market guidance in the years leading up to that, giving recommendations and guidance to manufacturers of things that they should be doing to harden those devices. And those documents, the pre-market guidance, is still the framework of cybersecurity that the regulations are based on. And so if you're looking for the blueprint, we're going to talk about some of the things that you need to do. But if you want the deep dive, you go find the pre-market guidance from the FDA on the things that they're recommending, and we'll talk about those. But the FDA has been at this for over a decade. They've been working on this for a long time. It's been a collaborative effort with NIST, with all the manufacturers. HDOs have participated. And I applaud the FDA for the work that they've done on that, and for being strong enough to move it towards regulation and not just recommendations. Recommendations never work. You need regulations, especially in a critical infrastructure where the devices are being used to provide critical patient care. The regulation is applicable for anything that is labeled a cyber device, and that's any device. I like to say it's with software that's running on it, right? It's any device that has software that's running is considered a cyber device. The pre-market guidance is no longer, I mentioned this, it's no longer optional. I still hear people say, well, it's guidance. That's accurate, but the FDA can now block your submissions. So the process, you guys, manufacturers, 510K, when you have a new product that's going to market, you have to fill out a bunch of criteria, you submit it to the FDA. The FDA can look at that, and they now require you to submit questions around what the cyber protections are for that device. And if you don't meet the right standards, they will reject the submission and send it back and say, try again. And so the Food and Drug Administration now has it. It is not optional. Even though the document is still called pre-market guidance, it is not optional. You have to be doing these things for medical devices that are going to market. The guidance outlines processes and procedures to implement cybersecurity. It's best practices 101. The cyber practices that the guidance gives It's not rocket science. Those of us in cybersecurity, they're things that work, they're proven, and I'll be walking through some of those. It also asks manufacturers to have a plan for addressing cyber vulnerabilities. The industry over the last decade has worked really hard to have what are called vulnerability disclosure policies. And many manufacturers have those up on their website, and they say, hey, when you find a vulnerability with our device, here's the process you need to follow to let us know about it, and then we'll work with you to mitigate and make sure that those things are closed. And so the Food and Drug Administration is really emphasizing that coordinated approach, making sure that there's good information sharing and that vulnerabilities are handled appropriately. One of the things that I think is really great, cybersecurity is an ever-evolving practice. It's never, hey, set it and forget it. There's a lot of things that continue to change. Technology gets better, our defenses have to get better. And so the Food and Drug Administration is now requiring connected devices going to the market to have the ability to be updated. And you need to do that to stay ahead of security threats. And the last thing in a new practice is software bill of materials, or SBOMs. They are requiring when manufacturers submit the 510K that it includes a software bill of materials. Now, does everybody know what a SBOM is? Or should I spend a minute on that? Okay. It's basically your ingredient list, so you know what software is included in that package. That, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but SBOMs are becoming a tool not just in healthcare, but that are used to communicate to anybody purchasing your product what is part of it. What are the risks inherent in the products that you're buying? And so in my opinion, it's a really good move and step forward. So let's talk about, I put this together and I've used this quite a bit, but the guidance that the FDA has put out has approaches for identity and protecting devices. And then it has guidance around detecting incidents, responding to incidents, and recovering from incidents. 2 different categories in the guidance. Now, if you look at these approaches, user authentication, mutual authentication, access controls, device identity, lockout policies, these are security approaches that really are not like groundbreaking. They're things that have been around that work. And secure boot, whitelisting, key management, and all of these are based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. So another good resource document for you as you're navigating the FDA guidance is to look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, because the guidance is based on those practices and that approach. Now, the interesting thing, I talked about cryptography. This now shows, the ones highlighted in blue, security approaches that leverage public key infrastructure and cryptography. So I get asked all the time, the guidance, there's a lot of things that you need to be doing. Where should you start? What are the things that you should be doing when you're implementing and you're trying to be compliant with what the FDA is asking for? And I think public key infrastructure, cryptography, is the right starting point. Cryptography is the foundational element to all good security. Now, security is a layered approach, and you need to be doing other things. But I just want to emphasize that, of the, half of the approaches touch cryptography. Cryptography is very embedded in the guidance that they're having. And I say that because there's a lot today happening in cryptography. Better management, better visibility, transparency, having tools that allow organizations to better manage cryptography in their organization. And I say that because if you do not have that and you're starting to try to move into compliance with this, it's going to be messy for you. And so having good controls, having good tools that allow you to do that is going to become more and more important. And cryptography is not just for authentication and identity. Cryptography is also used in practices like code signing, and I'll talk briefly about that and how that works, and the use of keys and whatnot is used there. But PKI is very foundational to the security approaches that the FDA is pushing. Public key infrastructure does 3 main things. The first is authentication. So connected medical devices are connecting to gateways in hospital systems. They're connecting to other IT systems. They're connecting to the cloud. All of those connections need to be authenticated, and the FDA is very strong in saying that any IT system connecting to a medical device needs to have proper authentication. And certificates are the way you do that. When a device goes to talk to a gateway, what happens if a certificate is on both of those? It looks for a matching key and it authenticates. And there's a secure handshake that happens there that opens up an authenticated session that then sends encrypted data between those two devices. So PKI does authentication. The second one is encryption. As I just talked about, once you have the authentication, it opens up an encrypted tunnel that patient data can then securely flow from point to point without being intercepted. And the last thing public key infrastructure does is integrity. And when I think about integrity, I'm a type 1 diabetic. I have a glucose monitor that I'm constantly getting readings on my phone on. Now, if my glucose monitor tells me that my blood sugar is 400 and it's really 100 and I dose for that, that puts me in critical condition. The integrity of those numbers is absolutely critical. So when I think integrity, I think trustworthiness of data, trustworthiness of code. How do you know that the data, the code that you're looking at can be trusted? And the way you do that is through an approach called code signing or digital signatures that basically put a protective wrapper around the code or the data, and it allows it, once it's received by that party, if anything has happened to that code, the signature is no longer valid and it renders it, you're notified and you're aware that integrity is no longer intact there. And so the use of keys and certificates also helps with data integrity, code signing, and those types of approaches. So again, PKI is foundational in the approaches. I want to spend just a minute on authentication and identity, and this is a big one. We work with a lot of medical device manufacturers today, helping them establish identity so that they can do authentication. Now, in PKI, there's this thing called a root of trust. How many of you are aware of roots of trust? Just by raise of hands. Okay. So a root of trust is the anchor of trust with any PKI system that you're deploying. Roots of trust are typically stored offline, and they're protected by companies like DigiCert. Now, from a root of trust, you issue what's called an issuing certificate authority. All certificates out in the wild are issued by ICAs, issuing CAs or intermediate CAs. Now, for a manufacturer, what you do is like, let's say we're working with, let's pick on someone today. I think I saw an Abbott. We'll just pick Abbott. So Abbott comes and says, hey, yeah, there we go, you guys on the front row. Great customer also. Abbott says, hey, we want to set this up. We would establish a root of trust for Abbott. And then we would create an issuing CA. And they'd say, well, we want to provision certificates to our diagnostic devices. So from the issuing CA, they have a root, they would get an issuing CA. We would provision certificates to the devices, either at the point of manufacturing, on the assembly line. Some manufacturers like to do that out in the field once a device is turned on and live. Or we can actually work with them based on the chip and the microcontrollers that they're using on the device. We can even pre-bake those credentials into devices before they even hit the manufacturing line. So the first question you have to ask with certificates is, where are they going to be provisioned? And most commonly, we see that happen at the point of manufacturing, in the manufacturing line. But it can happen pre-assembly, manufacturing, or it can happen once the device is in the field. Now, at that time, we also put what's called an operational certificate on the device. Because the Food and Drug Administration is requiring manufacturers to do updates and to manage and monitor devices, what that operational certificate does is it allows the manufacturer to have ongoing secure communication with that device. So if you want to provision and update that to that device, you would use that operational certificate. You'd have a server on the back end that would send it. It would likely communicate with the gateway, because hospitals don't like direct connection to devices in the field. So it would go to that gateway, and then the gateway would provision the update controlled through the hospital. And it would be fully authenticated through that operational certificate. So operational certificates also allow you to do things like ongoing monitoring of devices. It allows you to have that secure, connected communication with the device. Through those certificates, you can do service validity, you can authenticate users to the device, inter-device services, and you can do software updates. And so that is how certificates work with connected medical device. Identity certificate and an operational certificate. And it allows you then to do and have ongoing secure authentication, secure encryption of data that's being moved from the device. And so that is how today a lot of manufacturers are doing that. In my last few minutes, I'll talk about software. Now, software is everywhere in the world today, and it's messy. And what I see with medical device manufacturers is not all software is homegrown. Most medical devices are an aggregate of open source software, third-party software, and homegrown software. Now, the challenge with that is as you integrate that into a build, how do you know that the parts you're getting from open source and from third party can be fully trusted? Have you done the right testing? Have you done the right analysis on that software? Now the FDA is requiring you to validate that any software running on the device is secure. And so software security is absolutely critical. We talked about the devices, we talked about certs and how they protect the device and they harden it from outside attackers. But software is something that can eat you alive from the inside if you don't secure it. And so software has to be secure. And the Food and Drug Administration is requiring binary analysis and software scanning. So you have to have the right tools. Before you sign it digitally, you need to know that all malware and all vulnerabilities have been properly addressed. And that would be reported through your software bill of materials. I think I can, I'll get to this slide in a second. So you have to know, I always say there are three things you need to do with software. And the first is you have to scan it so you know what's involved. And that would be open source, that would be third party, and that would be homegrown software. You have to know what is included in the software packages that you're sending to market. The second thing you have to do, once you've tested it and you know that it's secure and can be trusted, then you sign it with a digital signature, code signing, and at that point you put a stamp of integrity on it. If that code is altered at any point from that point forward, that digital signature renders the code useless. And that's how you maintain integrity with software, is through the practice of code signing. And then the third thing, and what the FDA is requiring manufacturers to do, is use a software bill of materials. So, and there are a lot of tools that are available on the market today for that. DigiCert has one as part of our platform. But once you've done that and you're getting ready to sell that to a hospital or submit it to the FDA, a software bill of materials is a great communication tool to say, if you're selling to a hospital, hey, we know the software that's embedded in our device, and let us communicate that to you through the software bill of materials. We can show you all of the ingredients. And that will give your customers, the healthcare systems, confidence that you know what you're doing with your software and that you've mitigated the vulnerabilities that are inherent in the code, and that they can trust that you have your hands wrapped around that. And so software bill of materials, even outside of healthcare, is becoming a common tool in procurement to help the buyers of your software know that it is trustworthy. Now, software attacks can happen at any stage. Typically, developers, they develop code, they assemble it into a build, they get third-party code, they integrate that into the build, and then they put together a package, they put a nice bow on it, and they deploy it to the customers. Now, you can have attacks at any part of this process. And so a good practice for software signing that we see this as a trend right now as well, is we are encouraging, and it's best practice with software, to sign throughout the process. You don't just sign your code before it's deployed. Because, and the reason is, if you have malware or a problem in that code, you don't know where in this process it came from. And so when your developers are done writing code, they should sign it. You should test it, you should sign it. There's integrity at that point. If you're integrating third-party code, you should test it, you should sign it. Once you've put your build together, you should test it, you should sign it. Once you put your package together, you should test it, you should sign it. And at that point, you now have a chain of trust from the development, the packaging, the build process, the integration, and the deployment, so that it can be trusted. That is the best practice that everybody needs to be doing who's developing software today, is making sure that you have signing throughout the process, not just at the very end when you're putting a bow on it. Software, like many of you may have heard about the SolarWinds attack several years ago. SolarWinds, raise a hand, you guys, are you familiar with that? Okay, so SolarWinds deployed software that had malware embedded in it to about 10,000 customers. It was a massive breach. And the interesting thing about that is SolarWinds actually signed that package with a DigiCert certificate. Now, the problem with that, there was nothing wrong with the certificate that we provided SolarWinds. The problem is SolarWinds did not know what was in the package. They implemented third-party software that had malware in it. They didn't do the right testing on it, and they said, okay, well, we're good. We're going to sign it. And they signed something that had malware in it and deployed it to customers, and it created massive havoc for them. That's why doing it throughout the process is so, so critical. Digital signatures and the tools that we provide you to do that are only as good as your scanning capabilities and your ability to detect the problems that are part of your source code. Wrapping up, there's a lot of organizational challenges with code signing. Today, having all your engineers in one place is no longer common. Most engineering teams are distributed across the world. So having a systematic approach that allows you to have the same practices with all your engineers, regardless of where they are geographically, is really important. Key protection is absolutely critical. DigiCert has a solution. We have HSMs in the cloud or on premise. Regardless, you have to be doing FIPS 140-3 level protection for those keys. The CAB forum is now requiring that. And so making sure that your keys are protected for all of your engineers globally, regardless of where they reside, and that you have the right processes. Organizations fail in code signing, not in the signing, but in the processes around the signing. Are you rotating the keys? Do you have rights management and access control for the engineers so that you can say, this engineer has the ability to sign this type of code, but we're not allowing them to sign a package before deployment? Rights management access control is very critical. Do you have the ability to revoke signing credentials if you have a disgruntled employee or someone who gets laid off? Or do they maintain the keys to the kingdom until you can get those back? Those are real scenarios that we see organizations struggle with. And so having those level of control around signing is absolutely critical. I'm just kind of talking and not using my slides, and I hope that's okay. The last thing I'll say about cryptography is the other thing is post-quantum computers are coming, and all asymmetric cryptography out in the world today is going to need to migrate to post-quantum cryptography in the next 7 to 10 years. And so if you think cryptography is hard today and managing certificates is hard, the migration to post-quantum cryptography is a massive undertaking, and it's something just from an awareness standpoint that I'm encouraging organizations to start thinking about. The most recent HIPAA guidance is actually talking about preparing and using encryption technologies that are bulletproof for future technology like quantum computers. And so if it's not on your organization's radar yet, I would encourage you to start thinking about that migration and what's going to happen. Certificates are everywhere in all organizations. All of that is going to need to be migrated. Device certificates, user certificates, devices within enterprises, your laptops, your VPN connections, all of your systems, all of that is going to have to migrate to post-quantum algorithms that are now on the market over the next 7 to 10 years. And stuff's going to break when that happens. And so my encouragement there is to be thoughtful, start thinking about it today. That migration is going to take a lot of time and effort. That's all I got today. Any questions? Anyways, I'll just take questions. Any questions? I'll repeat it so that you can.
Okay. So, for SBOMs, I've heard about hand assembling an SBOM, and then also looking for an embedded
Yeah.
and then also looking at vulnerability software that needs SBOMs. A lot of times you're looking at Python like a big package
Yep.
or something, and that's not necessarily a guarantee of what's in the code. So
Yeah.
what have you seen as being sufficient? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so there's different, great question. So the question is, how do you know what's sufficient when you're doing an SBOM, and how do you know what levels to share? what I would tell you is there are great tools that are out there on the market. What you share is a level that your organization has to decide. We're working with manufacturers that are like sharing much more details when they're making submissions to the FDA, and some organizations are sharing much less. You have to make that decision within your organization as to what you're going to decide. And I'd be happy to kind of share with you more. I think I need to get off the stage. DigiCert's booth is right over here. I would be happy to have more conversations. I'm going to be around the rest of the day. I'd be happy to answer any questions around software, around how you protect devices, or around any of the other FDA stuff. But thanks so much for attending today.